Nevada. I'm from the holy Las Vegas, New Mexico, the original Las Vegas. So I was assigned there a couple months ago. Well, I guess it's not a couple now. It's about 8 months. And I'm the associate pastor there, but I'm also the chaplain to the Newman Center at Highlands University. So good to be here with you all this evening. Tonight we're going to be talking about, it was entitled The Mystery of Iniquity, also some subtopics, but probably the overarching theme is the problem of evil and original sin. So when Mr. Fogg invited me several months ago to give this talk, I had to kind of scratch my head and say, is he telling me something? The mystery of iniquity, the original sin, maybe these are things that I need to reflect on in my own life. And so I joked with Father Graham and said, I think they're inviting me because I'm a big sinner. And so he said, well, aren't we all? So Father Graham was very kind and affirmed me. But the problem of evil, the problem of sin, is probably the most serious problem in the world. Would you all agree with that statement? And it's also the one serious objection to the existence of God, believe it or not.
Right.
Atheists use this as their one serious objection to the existence of God. And when St. Thomas Aquinas wrote his great work, the Summa Theologica, he could find only 2 objections to the existence of God, even though he tried to at least list 3. And to every one of the thousands of these he tried to prove in that great work. But one of the 2 objections is the apparent ability of natural science to explain everything in our experience without God. So the apparent ability to explain, or for natural science to explain everything in our experience without God. And the other problem for him was the problem of evil. So more people have abandoned their faith because of the problem of evil, more than any other reason. Evil has skewed people and they've left their faith, and this is a big scandal in our church, that people would leave. And it is certainly the greatest test of faith, right? We all know evil exists, and yet we're still able to maintain that relationship with God. We're still able to draw close to Him. We're still able to believe. And so for some, it's been the greatest test of faith, the greatest temptation to unbelief is this problem with evil. And it's not just an intellectual objection, because we feel it, right? We feel evil, because we feel suffering and pain, right? We live it, you can't even, it's devastating what happened on Sunday at that church. Or you can't even go to Walmart because you'll get gunned down. So not only do we feel it, but we live it. We live in this fear. And I think that's why the book of Job is so interesting for us in regards to the problem of evil. Because Job endured a lot of evil. But the problem can be stated very simply. This is the argument of atheists. If your God is so good, why is his world so bad? If God is so good, why is his world so bad? If an all-good God, all-wise, all-loving, all-just, and all-powerful God is running the show, why does he seem to be doing such a miserable job of it? This is kind of the question that atheists put forth. Why do bad things, another way we can put it is, why do bad things happen to good people? Why do bad things happen to good people? So the unbeliever who asks that question is usually feeling a bit of resentment or rebellion against God, because they've felt this pain. They've lived this pain. And, so they feel this resentment, and it's not just lacking evidence for his existence. These are things that they felt. Some of you are familiar with C.S. Lewis, right? C.S. Lewis recalls that as an atheist, he did not believe God existed. This is one of a brilliant mind who's written many books on Christianity, and he didn't believe God existed. And he was very angry with God for not existing. He says, I was very angry, I was pissed with God because he didn't exist. But he was also angry with him for having created the world. Very interesting. So when you talk to such a person, remember that it is more like talking to a divorcee than to a skeptical scientist. The reason for unbelief is an unfaithful lover, not an inadequate hypothesis. And so the unbeliever's problem is not just a soft head, but a hard heart. I think evil hardens people's hearts because they participate in it. And a good apologist knows how to how to let the heart lead rather than the head. Okay, so we have to let the heart lead. And so a lot of times when we get into these arguments of, well, if your God is so good, why is there evil? We want to talk this out from the head. But really, we should be talking these things out from the heart. Heart speaks to heart. Okay? And so let's start with original sin. Original sin, goes back to the beginning of creation with Adam and Eve. And so remember, when God created everything, after he had created it, he saw that it was good. So that is our first inclination that God is good. In his creation of the cosmos and the world, God created things by word, and he said that they were good. He deemed it good. Because he himself is good. And these things, his creation, is a reflection of his goodness. And then comes the problem of evil. We see that beastie boy, in the form of a serpent, come and trick Eve in the garden, and then, somehow Adam gets bamboozled and they fall into original sin. And so people say, well, why should the sins of the past affect us? Why should original sin, why is that my fault? And we might ask that, why is that my fault? That was their stupid mistake. Well, because we're all connected. They were our fathers in faith, and so we're connected to them. But I was reading up on this, and one theologian suggests that just as we are present at Calvary whenever we celebrate Eucharist, and we participate in that sacrifice on Calvary, we participate in that act of original sin. It's a very interesting comparison, but I think it works. So that's original sin. We all are born with original sin, and it goes away at baptism, right? And so so now original sin has filtered into our world through mortal sin, right? We all make conscious decisions to sin or not to sin, So there are 4 parts to the solution to the problem of evil. So first, evil is not a thing. It's not an entity, and it's not a being. Okay, so it's not a thing, it's not an entity, and it's not a being. All beings are either the creator or creatures created by the creator. Right? You and I are all created by the creator, and we're beings. And God himself is a being, he's the creator. But everything God created is good. We just spoke about this. According to Genesis, when God created something, he created it to be good. And we naturally tend to picture evil as a thing. It's funny. I was visiting one of our catechism classes yesterday, and they asked him to draw the creation of the world, and some little girl drew this black cloud, and I said, oh, she's twisted, but that was her interpretation, and we think of evil as a black cloud or a dangerous storm or some angry face, that angry emoji. But these pictures mislead us because these are not, evil's not a thing. If God is the creator of all things and evil is a thing, then God is the creator of evil. That would follow logically, we'll ask the lawyer. And he's to blame for its existence, right? If God is the creator of all things and evil is a thing, then God is the creator of evil, and he's to blame for its existence. But evil is not a thing. It's a wrong choice. It's a wrong choice. Or the damage done by a wrong choice, right? So evil's no more a positive thing than blindness is, but it is just as real. It's not a thing, but it's not an illusion either. Evil's real. It's very real. We experience it. And so, if it's not a thing, then God didn't create it. So, the second argument to this, or the second solution to the origin of evil, is not the creator, but the creators the creatures freely choosing sin and selfishness. You know, we create evil. We create evil. We continue to maintain evil as human beings. I'm not saying you all do this, you know. We're all in this together. But take away all sin and selfishness, and guess what? We'd have heaven here on earth. If you took away sin and selfishness, the world would be at peace. The world would be at perfect peace. We would experience shalom. But guess what? That's not what we have here because of original sin and because we continue to make wrong choices. We continue to rebel against God. So even the remaining physical evils would no longer rankle and embitter us, right? So there's a different, there's mortal sin and then there's physical, mortal evil and physical evil. Does anyone know the difference? No? So a moral evil is like abortion or killing, right? Killing people, innocent people in a church, stealing. Those are moral evils, right? Using your power of position for wrongdoings. Those are moral evils. And then there's physical evils, what we would call physical evils. Does anyone know what that might be?
So like hurricanes and natural disasters.
Exactly. Natural disasters they're beyond our control, right? I mean, unless we can figure out a way to stop a hurricane, we haven't been able to do that yet. But these are evils that happen. We call them evils, right? Also things like famine. You know, I would say that a person who is homeless and hungry and no one helps him, that's a great evil, right? Another way to look at it is injustice. And so these things, you know, if we had perfect peace and there was no more evil, then the physical evils, natural evils, would no longer rankle and embitter us. And we see throughout history that the saints endure and even embrace suffering and death, right? Death is an evil. Did God create death? Not originally, right? It was not in his original plan. Death came because of our wrongdoings, of our failures. And so the saints throughout history embraced suffering and death as lovers of embracing heroic challenges, heroic virtue. But the one thing that the saints all have in common is that they never embraced sin. They never embraced sin. They sought to live lives that were holy and pleasing to God. So, furthermore, the cause of physical evil is spiritual evil. Physical evil exists because of spiritual evil. The cause of suffering is sin. You know, after Genesis tells the story of the good God creating the good world, it next answers the obvious question: where did evil come from then? And by the story of the fall of mankind, we begin to comprehend this. And how do we understand this? How can spiritual evil, how can sin cause physical evil, suffering, and death? Well, God, we know, is the source of all life and all goodness and all joy. Right? That's our experience of God. And therefore, when the human soul rebels against God, it loses its life and joy. Because that sin kills the soul. It cuts off our relationship to the divine. And now a human being is, we understand that a human being is body as well as soul. We are single creatures, not double. We are single creatures. We are not even body and soul. A lot of times we use these terms. We're body and soul as much as we are embodied soul, or soul-ensouled bodies. And so the body must share in the soul's inevitable punishment. And a punishment as natural and unavoidable as broken bones. If you're jumping like a maniac on a trampoline and you fall off and break your bones, well, there's a consequence to that. Or a sick stomach from eating that awful pizza maybe the night before, not the one you're having. Or, something as external as a grade from a course, you didn't study, you didn't get a good grade. Or, when you're little and you're taking sweets from the kitchen and you get a slap on the hand, your soul shares in that, it participates in that. And so whether this consequence of sin was a physical change in the world or only a spiritual change in human consciousness, whether the thorns and thistles grew in the garden only after the fall or whether they were always there but were only felt after after we had fallen, is another question. But in either case, the connection between spiritual evil and physical evil has to be as close as a connection between the two things they affect, the body and the soul. They're connected just like our human soul and our human bodies are connected. And if the origin of evil is free will, and God is the origin of free will, isn't God then the origin of evil? That's what atheists would say. And only as parents are the origin of the misdeeds their children commit by being the origin of their children, the all-powerful God gave us a share in his power to choose freely. Right? We all have what's called free will. And we use this every day. Do I want to get up and go to class or not? Maybe I want to sleep in. Maybe I should really get up and go to class. For me, sometimes I really just want 10 more minutes, but I know I'm going to be late if I don't get up and go say mass. Other things are, there's this really nice, we'll use something silly, like a logo pen. It doesn't belong to me, but should I take it? It's just sitting on this desk, or will someone return for it? We are confronted by our free will every day, and we have the power to choose freely. And so would we prefer, it's almost, this would be kind of a retaliation or a question we could ask. Would we prefer that he had not and had made us robots rather than human beings? That we're all just kind of programmed to do the good? Always? That would infringe on our free will, right? We'd all be cookie cutters of each other, But God gave us free will to choose. And he gave us the ability to choose him. St. Augustine writes about that in his Confessions. Our hearts are restless until they rest in thee. So we have this innate desire for God, but because of our perspective, our experience of the world and the evil in it, sometimes we gravitate to the thing that's not so good for us, to the thing that's evil. So a third part of the solution to the problem of evil is, and this is probably the most important part, how to resolve the problem in practice and not just in theory. How do we resolve the problem in practice and not just in theory? In life and not just in thought. We can sit here and kind of suggest, we can do all these things and evil would go away. But until we start actually living this, what good is it? So although evil is a serious problem for thought, it is even more of a problem in life. But even if you think the solution in thought is obscure and uncertain, the solution in practice is as strong and clear as the sun. It is clear, it is strong and clear as the sun. For us as people of faith, it's not the big thing that gives us heat and light during the day. It's Jesus Christ, the eternal Son. He's the one that is the simple solution to the practice in practicing an end to evil. So the Father, we all know, loves us, and so he sent his Son to die for us to defeat the power of evil. The greatest of that evil being death, right? He conquered this on Easter Sunday. And that's the heart of the Christian story. And we do not worship a deistic God. We don't worship an absentee landlord who ignores his slum. We worship a garbage man God. Don't be offended by that language. This is just kind of an analogy. We worship a garbage man God who came right down into our worst garbage to clean it up. That's the God we worship. And how do we get God off the hook for allowing evil? God is not off the hook, because he is the hook. He's hanging there on the cross. He is the hook. We don't need to get God off the hook for evil. He is the hook. The cross is God's part of the practical solution to evil. Why is this? Well, think back to, how many of you have seen that movie, the film The Passion? It's pretty gory, right? Pretty gruesome. That was probably that is the biggest evil I think the world had ever seen. That we crucified a holy man, God himself. And so God transforms that. The paradox of the cross, that something so evil can become something so good. And so our part, according to the same gospel, we're called to repent. We're called to repent. We're called to believe. Jesus, in the Latin church, the past couple of weeks, he's been beating us, you hypocrites. He's been saying to the Pharisees. And sometimes I'm like, oh, geez, he's speaking right to me. But he's calling us to repent. That if we say that we believe this, then we better be living it. He's calling us to believe and to work with him in fighting evil by the power of love. And so the king has invaded, and now we are just finishing up the mop-up operation. God, the garbage man God that we serve, now we're just mopping up. So finally, what about the philosophical problem? Is it not logically contradictory to say that an all-powerful God, an all-loving God, tolerates so much evil when he could eradicate it? Could God do that? Certainly. He's God. So why do bad things happen to good people? Why do bad things happen to good people? Yes, sir.
It's because we, with free will, choose to do wrongs to other people, not that God directly does evil to us.
Okay.
And we sometimes blame him for it, although it's not his fault.
Sure. Someone else? Yes, sir.
I was going to say, maybe in some form or fashion it's necessary, because you don't know what good is if you don't have evil to compare it to, maybe.
That's true. And we see atheists, they have a moral standard, right?
Yeah.
Well, they use our Christian moral standard.
Yeah.
They just don't leave God out of it, but they use our moral standard to judge good and evil, because they believe in evil, right? That's not the problem. It's just they're saying, well, if God is so good, then why does he allow evil? Why did he create it? So they believe in the problem of evil, but they use our moral standard to kind of base that off of.
Because good things also happen to bad people.
Bingo. So who's to say that we're good people? Who's to say that we're good people?
In the Mass, in Spanish, we have a song that's, I don't know if it's in English too, but in Spanish say that transform the suffering of the poor into the wine, the blood. And it's hard for me to understand, but kind of, for me, it is the answer. that without the suffering of the good people, the ones we are bad, we won't be able to have this excuse to unite to the suffering of Jesus. Kind of my understanding.
I'll say freedom. God gives us freedom, and my freedom finishes where His freedom starts. And if I over abuse my freedom, how do you say libertarian? Sorry.
Yeah, freedom. A free will.
No, libertarian.
Yeah, I'd say just freedom.
Sorry, it's like
Liberty.
libertinity, probably. I don't. When I abuse my freedom, I don't know if you understand what I'm trying to say. So that's, I think, one of the biggest gifts of God, and when we abuse of that, that's when we make bad things happen.
It's true. Good. Okay, anyone else? Yes, sir.
I was gonna say, like, if you're following your faith, a lot of times, like, a lot of success, or like you said, good people, or like good things happening to good people or bad people, whatever. A lot of people fall into the thing of, like you said, like maybe what atheists might see, the worldly success. So that's what they believe success is, and it's not. It can be misleading, you know. So that's what they're. Yeah, and especially since so many people are not, as you said earlier, evil does influence people in a bad way, since so many people believe that in the worldly success, that's what their idea of success is, not the other stuff.
Right. And the world does, you know, they don't look at what we view as people who are striving for holiness. They don't view our success the same as theirs, you know.
Yeah.
For the saints, their success was, you know, to live and die for Jesus. You know, that would be insane to, you know, they mark their success by their power, by money, by possessions. So, you know, the gospel of prosperity, you know, that's what defines their success.
Yeah, even you said, oh sorry, I was gonna say, even Joel Osteen says the same thing. He's like, you can get rich, but rich in what though? In you know, like towards your salvation, not towards, you know, like worldly possessions are only, you know, they're only good for so much. You don't get taken with you.
Yes, sir.
And it could be, like you said, the definition of bad people and good people is skewed. Maybe their definition of bad things and good things is skewed too. Maybe what they perceive as what they perceive as disaster, or sort of a crestfall. Can you use that as a noun? They're a great fall for them might actually be a bonus to them. Like if they spend all their time at work and have so many nice things but never see their children, and they lose that job, then is that a bad thing, or is it a good thing because now they can devote themselves to being a parent?
Right. There's some give and take in that, yeah. Okay. I like Daniel stole my thunder. But you know, who is to say that we're good people? We're creatures. God created us to be good. And so the question should be not why do bad things happen to good people, but why do good things happen to bad people? Why, you know, let's turn that around. And I think we did that. So let's use the example of the fairy godmother. You know, she tells Cinderella, what does she tell her? You can't wear your magical gown until, you can only wear it until midnight, right?
Slippers.
And your magic slipper, thank you.
Magic
The whole get-up, yeah. It disappears. So your magic slipper until midnight. You know, our question, because we're human, and we tend to be a little rebellious, you know, we want the good, but we also sometimes, so, you know, her question is like, well, why can't I just wear it longer, you know? Why can't I wear it after midnight? Why don't, but she should turn it around and say, well, why do I even get to wear this at all? You know? So the question is not why the glass of water is half empty, but why it's half full. What is goodness for us? What is this gift for us? So the best people are the ones who are most reluctant to call themselves good people, right? This has been my experience. You know, the best people that I know are people who are very reluctant to say they're good people. You know, I hear this all the time. People will come into the confessional and they'll say, Father, I have no sins. I'm a very good person. And I say,
Very true.
wow. Let's take our Blessed Mother statue down and put you up, you know, a living saint. But, you know, if we were truly good people, we would be a little bit reluctant because there's that problem, you know, of good and evil. We're sinners, you know. We're sinners, we're striving for sainthood, but we're still on the road, and so we'll fall. And the saints recognize that, you know. The best man who ever lived once said, no one is good but God alone. No one is good but God alone. We all know who the best man who ever lived was, who said those words. So, second, who's to say suffering is all bad? Who's to say that suffering is all bad? You know, life without it would produce spoiled brats and tyrants. You know, not joyful saints. It would produce spoiled brats and tyrants. You know, sometimes maybe we act like spoiled brats. Maybe we act like tyrants, you know. Rabbi Abraham Heschel says simply that the man who has not suffered, what can he possibly know anyway? The man who has not suffered, what can he possibly know anyway? Because suffering can work for the greater good of wisdom. And it's not true that all things are good, but it's true that all things work together for the good to those who love God. That's what St. Paul tells us, right? And third, who's to say we have to know all God's reasons? You know? Who's to say we're talking about the mystery of iniquity. It is what it is. It's a mystery. You know, we can understand, we call the Eucharist a mystery, you know, the mystery of faith. The cross is a great mystery. And so while we can know some of the things about this mystery, we don't know the totality, and we won't until we see God face to face. So who's to say that we need to know all of God's answers now? You know, whoever promised us those answers? You know, that's where our spoiled brat comes out, because we demand to know all the answers, you know. Animals can't understand much about us, right? You know, your dog might be able to sense when you're a little sad or when something's up, but, you know, they can't communicate with you. Why? You know, I hope, maybe you do. Maybe you sit down and you have a heart-to-heart with them and say, you know, my girlfriend, you know, blah, blah, blah. But animals can't understand, you know, the heart can't speak to heart there. And so why should we be able to understand everything about God? You know, especially in this life. The obvious point of the book of Job, the world's greatest exploration of the problem of evil, is that we just don't know what God is up to. We don't know what God is up to, but He's up to something. He's acting. You know, He just doesn't sit up in heaven all day and chill, you know. He's not watching Netflix. He's not, you know, he might, some of our lives might be a Netflix series, but, you know, He's doing something. He's acting, because that's what God does. He acts. And so we have a hard lesson to learn. And the first lesson is that we're ignorant of these things. We're infants. You know, we don't know all of this. All of this has not been revealed to us. But it will, provided that we cooperate with grace and we continue on the path towards righteousness so we see Him in heaven. And you know, no wonder why Socrates was declared by the Delphic oracle to be the wisest man in the world. He interpreted that declaration to mean that he alone knew what he did not have, that he did not have wisdom. Remember that from your philosophy? And that was true, wisdom for man. So, you know, think about this. A child on a 10th story of a burning building can't see firefighters with their safety net on the street, and they call up, jump. You know, jump. We'll catch you. Trust us. And the child says, I'm not going to jump. I can't see you. I can't see. I'm not going to jump. How do I know you'll catch me? And the firefighter replies, that's all right. I can see you. I can see you. We're like that child, you know. Evil is like the fire, and our ignorance is like the smoke. And God is that firefighter calling us. And it's Christ who's that safety net that catches us and gives us perfect freedom from evil. And so, if there are situations like this where we must trust even infallible human beings with our lives, where must we trust what we hear, not what we see? Then it is reasonable that we must trust the infallible, all-seeing God when we hear from His Word but do not see from our reason of experience. We cannot know all God's reasons, but we can know why we cannot know, because He hasn't revealed them to us yet. And God has let us know, He's let us on to a lot, right? We know a lot. We can define things. We can dive into mystery. But we will never understand the totality. And He's lifted up the curtain, He's lifted up the veil, on the problem of evil with Christ. And there, the greatest evil that ever happened, both the greatest spiritual evil and the greatest physical evil, both the greatest sin and the greatest suffering, is revealed as His wise and loving plan to bring about the greatest good, right there on Calvary. And the salvation of the world from sin and suffering eternally. There, the greatest injustice, as I already mentioned, of all time is integrated into the plan of salvation. The greatest injustice that St. Paul calls the righteousness of God. Because love finds a way, and love can be tricky, but love needs to be trusted, and Christ is love. So where does that leave us? You all know G.K. Chesterton? Time magazine asked him, what's the problem with the world? What's the greatest problem in the world? And he wrote back, I am. I am. And I think that could be said for each and every one of us. We're the greatest problem in the world. Because when we see an injustice, is our immediate reaction to correct it? I'm ashamed to say this. I was in a hurry to get here, and I saw a homeless man, and he looked authentically homeless, as one can look, I suppose. And, he asked for a couple bucks, and I was just kind of had to put tunnel vision, because I couldn't be bothered. And then I was walking over here, and I was like, here you are going to go talk about the problem of evil, and you're part of the problem. So God reveals Himself to us in those ways. I think G.K. Chesterton speaks to us. What is the greatest problem in the world? We are. Because what are we doing to stand up to correcting these problems? What are some ways that we can? We could be like Congress and sit around the table all day and do nothing and talk about it, but until it's actually fixed, nothing happens, right? But if we're created in the image and likeness of God, and God acts, we're called to act. And this mystery of iniquity, this problem of evil, is something that's very real. It's something that we live, it's something that we experience. So what are we doing? How are we changing the world? Even if it's through a little gesture, So the worst aspect of the problem of evil is eternal evil. That's hell, right? Eternal evil is hell. Total absence and separation from all that is good, which is God. So does hell not contradict a loving and omnipotent God? No, because hell is the consequence of free will. Hell is the consequence of free will. We freely choose hell for ourselves. God doesn't choose it for us. God does not cast anyone into hell against His will. If a creature is really free to say yes to God, then they're just as equally free to say yes to hell. And so that is what hell is. Free will, in turn, was created out of God's love. Hell, evil wasn't created by God. But free will was. It was created for us to choose Him. So no sane person wants hell to exist. I don't want hell to exist. I had a seminary formator that said, he said, I'd like to think that God, he how did he phrase it? I don't want to get his words. Oh, I think he was saying something towards atheists, like, you know, if God is all loving, then why is not everyone in heaven? You know, and it'd be nice for us to be able to think, well, everyone goes to heaven, but what are the consequences of our free will? You know, if we don't choose him, we don't choose him in eternity either, you know. We choose what we choose. So no sane person wants evil to exist. I don't want hell to exist. I don't think Father wants hell to exist. But hell is just evil eternalized. Hell is just evil eternalized. And if there is evil, and if there is eternity, there can be hell. You know, that's another thing. People don't believe in hell. You know, they say, my life is my hell. You know, my marriage is my hell. My job is my hell. It's sad days for them, you know. But if it is intellectually dishonest to disbelieve in evil just because it's shocking and uncomfortable, it is the same with hell. You know, reality has hard corners. It also has a lot of surprises and terrible dangers in it. And we desperately need a true roadmap. Not nice feelings, you know, we can't just move about the world with just feelings. And it's true, as people often say, that hell just fills on will. It's impossible. But guess what? So did Auschwitz and Calvary. And they were very real. So again, what are we doing to correct the problem of evil? If the problem is us, how are we approaching that and correcting it? This is what I leave you with as a question to ponder. Anyone have any questions, any comments you'd like to discuss?
So, is the cause of evil accidental the way St. Thomas Aquinas said it was?
I'm not sure. Think about that. Father, what would you say?
I don't know Aquinas very well, because I'm Byzantine.
So what did Chrysostom say?
You mean Chrysostom?
Chrysostom.
He's not a flower.
I'm sorry.
The true Latin. So say it again.
That the cause of... Okay, so St. Thomas Aquinas said that God is not the direct cause of evil, but the accidental one, because, like... Okay, so that doesn't mean that God... Because we know God doesn't do anything by accident.
No, you're right.
Yeah, it does
Right.
everything
He's
with
not
a
the
plan.
direct cause of
But it's
evil.
like, okay, so... relating it to the... Okay, trying to metaphoricalize it using the Eucharist. So we call that the Eucharist, when it's consecrated, right, the accidents of bread and wine are still the same, but its essence is Christ. So accidents, I mean, in philosophical language, is that like what's left over? What's left over is what you can see, right? So, like...
What St. Thomas Aquinas is saying, like...
Yeah, it's like it's what's left. It's
Right,
the cause
so-
of free will. It's like God is the direct
Right, so-
cause of free will, but
Right.
what's left over from free will is
Yeah,
potentially
I
evil.
don't think it's... I wouldn't want to say leftover. Like
Okay,
the
yeah,
acc-
so maybe not good.
So like a way to understand it is this, like the accident of me setting my phone down is moving that glass.
Yeah,
It's just, it's not the direct,
Not the direct
yeah.
it's not the
But-
direct cause,
there
but
you
it's
go,
an
yeah.
accident of it.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say leftover, like the bread and wine aren't leftover.
Yeah, that's a terrible way of phrasing it, but it's
Yeah.
just what,
That's what he's saying, that God is the accident.
yeah,
The accidents of God is evil doesn't mean that
yeah,
it's
no.
leftover.
Yeah, and you can't even say the indirect cause of evil, just accidental cause, like it's just,
Accidentalized.
by virtue of creating free beings,
Exactly.
the angels, whatnot, it's like,
Yeah.
that is what you're asking for, or what can
Right.
That's
be a
the
possibility.
potential can happen.
Potential, yeah,
Right.
The potential is there for evil to take place.
yeah.
By giving everybody free will, including the angels.
But the potential is there to also do good.
Yeah,
Right.
But God is all goodness, and so
yeah.
Earlier you asked the question, I'm not sure if it was not to be answered, and I apologize for earlier almost disrupting, but would you not say that the reason, or a possible reason why God gave us free will is because it means a lot more for another human being to say I love you than something that's like a robot that you program it to?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, if God created us particularly, without free will to just choose Him, we're just puppets in a sense. We're robots. But if He created us with free will, He leaves it up to us. He says, look, I created you, I love you, I created you into being, and it's up to you whether or not you want to love me in return. It's up to you whether you want to spend eternity with me. God isn't going to He's not going to manipulate us into loving Him. He wants us to love Him out of desire. We have the desire. Now it's what we do with that desire. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Did you have a question?
I do.
Yes.
So in recent years, especially with the canonization of Saint Teresa of Calcutta, a lot of atheists have brought up how it's twisted to think that suffering is worthwhile, that suffering is good. And I've had a hard time of trying to think of how to explain to someone that suffering is worthwhile if they're just a materialist. How can you explain to somebody that suffering is
Virtuous.
Yeah, suffering has virtue and worth. If they see nothing beyond the world around us.
Well, I'm not really sure that we can convince them. I think this rabbi I quoted, he says, if they've never experienced suffering, what do they know anyways? We've all experienced some kind of suffering, but I think from us as Catholics, we use the cross as our standing ground, Okay, Jesus suffered, and if I suffer and I'm united to Him in this suffering, it's in a sense redemptive. It's transformative. But for an atheist, there's you can't follow that logic because nothing is going to convince them. And so that's why they thought Mother Teresa was so twisted. They thought she was a sick woman, But in her faith and in her love for God, she was trying to say, okay, your situation sucks. It's terrible. But unite yourself to Jesus and let that transform you. And we see this in the lives of the saints. How many of them have had to suffer greatly? And they suffered with great joy, And so, I don't know how we could.
I think if someone's a hedonist, that's the worst evil for them is discomfort. If someone's a hedonist, so you wouldn't be able to, but you could say that someone's suffering. I don't want to. I have to formulate it better than I have to explain it. But yeah, for someone that's a hedonist, it's impossible because that is bad. That's intrinsically bad in their worldview, I guess.
That's also, one atheist said to Mother Teresa, went to see her at the house for the dying, and watched her wash. There was a man who had been left to die on the street, and there were maggots in his wounds. So he had been there for a long time. And she was cleaning all this out, and then she kissed him. And he said, I would not do that for $1 million. And she said, neither would I. I do it for Jesus. And I think that's the thing with atheism. They miss the boat. Today is the anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. 100 years ago today, Lenin took over the government in Petrograd. And then, within 5 years, all of Russia was communist, and within another 20 years, half of Europe was communist. They would inflict suffering on others for the good of the revolution. So even an atheist would be able to see that some suffering can lead to a potential good towards their vision of utopia. Problem is, they never got to utopia. And no communist system can get to utopia because it's all based on hatred. And you can't have anything good resolved when your system is based on hatred.
Mhm.
And most atheists, I mean, it's not fair to say all atheists, but a lot of atheists are there because of what Father said earlier. You know, they're spurned lovers, they're divorced from God, they're angry at God because their grandparents died when they were little, their parents died when they were little, no one explained death to them, you know, as hopeful. And they carry that the rest of their lives. Until they run into a believer, you know, like C.S. Lewis met. What was your name? Joy. His wife's name is Joy, which is perfect. She actually brought him joy. You know, but before that he was a very angry, embittered man.
And then, returning to C.S. Lewis, C.S. Lewis proposes that on the flip side is we have the problem of good. If evil is so overwhelming and powerful and pervasive, then how can there be people like Mother Teresa? How can there be people who give everything to go and work as missionaries in the Congo? And do you think that carries the same philosophical weight as the problem of evil?
I don't know that it carries the same weight, because by design we were created for the good, you know, but creation got perverted and you know, we met corruptibility and you know, sometimes we do stupid things and choose the wrong things. We make decisions, and so sometimes you know, if I choose to do something evil to you, and then you blame it on God, you know, that's not really fair. You know, but I don't know. That's an interesting question. We're curious.
Rachel?
I don't know if we already talked about this, but going back to suffering, didn't somebody say that to live is to suffer? Basically, I don't think that person was Catholic.
There's potential in there.
That was like.
You can't really live without it.
It's
Yeah.
true.
Yeah.
Really, anybody. The wealthiest person in the world suffers.
They suffer. And they suffer somehow, you know, whether it's through sickness or death or something. So you can't. Emotional.
Earlier, Daniel, you had asked of how to explain to an atheist why suffering is good. And I can't help but to think what you had said about without suffering, there's tyrants and snobs, or Israel or something. So would that not work?
Good, yeah.
So this argument may lend itself to a sort of problem of regression, but I've heard that once you explain that God did not create evil, that free will is responsible for the concept of evil's existence, and that it is original sin which tends free will towards evil rather than good. And then I've heard that if that's the case, then why, if the Garden of Eden was perfect and they were in perfect union with God, who is perfection itself, then why did they choose to turn away from God?
Because they were self-centered. They wanted to be like God.
Exactly.
They wanted more.
Yeah.
Right.
It wasn't enough to have perfection. You know, that's why, you know, God forbade them from eating from the tree of knowledge. And what did they do? They ate from that tree because the devil convinced them that because they said, oh, no, we can't. God said no, and they said, well, the devil says, well, of course you can, because God just doesn't want you to become like him, you know. And you know, that self-centeredness, that desire for more, you know, it's kind of this, you know, with love asks, what can I give, not what can I receive, you know, what do I get out of this? When we're self-centered, we ask, what's in it for me? Well, you know, that sounds like a pretty sweet deal to become like God, and so they took it.
But then, isn't self-centeredness a product of original sin then? How could they be self-centered before original sin?
They're still at free will.
Free will.
They could choose to want more and to be unhappy with what they were given, even though it was great. That's the thing. It's the hardship of free will. We make mistakes.
Oh, I was going to say, maybe that's why, as you said before, when good things happen to bad people and bad things happen to good people and vice versa. That's why I think there's so many issues too still in society, since so many people don't know faith or have no faith at all. Nothing they have, even if it's money, Bill Gates is the richest person in the world. Hopefully he's got some kind of faith. But the people who are also rich who are beneath him or whatever, they're never happy because they're missing that emotional. They have no faith. They have nothing. It's just all about money or whatever else they think. That's, yeah.
It's a passing.
There's something else missing in their life, and they know what it is. And they'll never.
They're passing happinesses, you know. There's a difference between happiness and joy. Joy is something that's sustained long term, and happiness, you know, I could drink a margarita and I could be very, very happy. Very sad when I get to the bottom of the glass, you know. Or I could go to Disneyland and I'm very happy at the happiest place on earth, but then when I figure out how much money I've spent, not so happy. You know, these things are passing. But joy, and for us as people of faith, as Christians, is a relationship with God, is Christ-centered. You know, that, okay, the world has, you know, we'll suffer in this world, you know, there's evil, but I still know that there's something greater than that exists.
So I alluded to this a little bit earlier, I think, but is the
Are
tree...
we talking about accidentals again?
No. Okay. None of that philosophical yet.
Okay.
The tree of the knowledge of good and evil, is it called such because, you know, it's both and knowledge of good and evil? It's not the tree of the knowledge of evil. Is it both because you need good in order to understand evil? Like, okay, so Adam and Eve were created in a state of perpetual bliss, right? But they wouldn't have known that as good, would they?
That's an interesting question.
Yeah.
Because they had no
frame of
they had
reference.
nothing to compare it with.
Compare it to, yeah.
You do come up with interesting ones, Victor. You are something.
It's kind of related to your question.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
They both come up with interesting things, these two.
Yeah, if there was no comparison, like, you know, how do we...
I mean, I guess it's...
Yeah.
I guess the only way to think about that is that...
Once you have the knowledge.
Yeah, because they know that all of this goodness and bliss comes from God, they very easily recognize that. So then what follows from that is that to disobey God would be the ultimate evil.
As a consequence.
Right, and so with the knowledge that if you eat of this tree, then you will be disobeying God, then they understand, because God told them,
And they have to know
you
we're
will,
greater than us.
right, they know because God told them that if you eat of this fruit, then you will die.
Surely die, yeah.
And so God makes it very clear
what the consequences.
Exactly. So, I mean, sure, they don't have an understanding of what evil in the world is.
Or dying is
Yeah.
until...
Yeah, it's another thing. Would he have known, because Adam was told first, obviously, when he said, you shall not eat of it lest you die, did he know what it meant to die?
No, he didn't.
Yeah, because they had,
Not
they were,
truly.
yeah, because to know evil is to have a loss of innocence, right? And that's what they were created in the state of innocence.
Yeah.
But it's like,
I mean, you could argue that to this day, no one knows what it's like to truly die because they can't exactly tell us about it.
That's true.
Not too many come back, no.
So Daniel, I think I can answer your question. So if you had an, I don't know why it makes me happy. I think of you arguing with someone and I think of you like giving them a good answer. I guess. So if say an atheist says, well, what good can evil, you know, if you're trying to suggest that evil can bring about some good, and you can ask them, you know, even if they're hedonists, I suppose you could say, to come from a philosophical standpoint, you could say, what's the highest good? And they would probably say happiness. And so you could say, in, you know, an Aristotelian idea of happiness is eudaimonia, which is an overall like happiness, like a good life. And so that in order to have that good life, in order to perfect your virtues through education and through relationships, that if you don't have suffering, then you can't more so perfect your eudaimonia, your happiness. Because without that, you'd have a very juvenile level of eudaimonia. But to achieve real happiness, you'd have to have that suffering in order to, you know, adjust your path in such a way to achieve a higher happiness.
So that it's getting the person to recognize that you are flawed, and by correcting those flaws, you get closer
Not even,
to this.
I wouldn't even say that they're innately flawed or naturally flawed, but that without a practice of virtue and habits, because in order to have that eudaimonia, you have to perfect your virtues, which in order to have virtues, you have to have habits. But you can't have good habits. You can't make your habits as good as they could be without having a suffering, because you don't know how to, you don't know what works. If you don't have any, you know, the best idea of happiness is not abundance, it's a moderation, he says. So in order to have that moderation, you also have to have a little suffering, because that's what makes the happiness the best, the eudaimonia.
It's sort of a growing pain, I guess.
I don't know if I would use it growing.
Yeah, it's kind of reductionist,
But just more like a moderation, I'd say.
Gotcha.
And that's the best
virtue,
state.
virtue lies in
In the
moderation.
mean, yeah. Virtue lies in the mean. So I would say that would be a good way to answer.
A question for you too, but it relates to something, the two documents we were talking about yesterday. You saw the one where they're introduced to the Vatican, or God, Victor, you were saying?
Yeah.
What was that one where the people should be, they should know, they should have like at least to be introduced to Catholicism.
Oh yeah, at least have the knowledge of the faith, right?
The knowledge of the faith, right? So, with what Father Chris was saying before, I think in a couple of cafe topics ago too, about the 40 years of communism, atheism being introduced all throughout Europe, leading up to where we are now in society. But with all that being said and done, and for people who are just never introduced to the faith at all, are they really getting their full chance to, I mean, if they're not even knowing, they don't have any idea or concept of the faith whatsoever, because what all they've been taught before, are they really getting to use their free will to their potential if they don't even know anything? I mean, is that,
Well, I
I'll
would
make
say,
it sound like kind of bad, but
well, do atheists use their free will to do good?
if they're a good person, I don't know. I don't know, it depends on the race, Father, I'm
Yeah.
not sure. You know.
And I think that it's all based off of experience and stuff, but I think we all have the innate desire to be good and to do good. And so, regardless of whether or not, they were ever introduced to the faith, we all have that potential to do good, just like we have the potential to do evil. But I think it's based off of personal experience, how you were raised, your perspective, your worldview, and so I think that I think our faith definitely gives us the ability to exercise our free will much better, but I would say that those who don't have a faith life, or those who have never been introduced to it, they still have that same capacity to do good. That would be my argument.
Natural law.
Yeah.
Okay.